goes over the importance of seeding depth. If you look at the bottom, the yield when it was planted at the recommended 0.8, what the yield did, and then if we double that, they lost about 204 pounds to the acre, and then if they tripled that, they lost about 338 pounds to the acre. So it's just really showing you the importance of that 0.8 inch seeding depth. Okay, fertilization strategy. This is once again talking about what I showed you earlier, and the spring applied nitrogen is really important, and the next slide is going to show you that. But as soon as it starts to tiller and green up and March comes and it starts to warm up and it starts to grow, we got to get that fertilizer on there really quickly, and that's what that orange box is showing you there at the growth stages. And then if you hit the next slide, Becca, it shows you why that's important. So looking at this graph, if you look at the goldish yellow line, you can see that's the nitrogen uptake line. And as soon as it greens up in the spring, it is uptaking all of that nitrogen in a very short window. So we like to tell people, looking at the weather, if it looks like it's starting to warm up, but that last frost, when you think, oh, this might be the last frost, there's a warm up coming, you're going to want to get that nitrogen on as quickly as possible at that point. If you wait a couple weeks, you might miss your window, and then a lot of that nitrogen is going to go unused, and then you're not going to see the yield benefits with that. This is just a picture between wheat and rye. Hybrid rye, a lot of people, since we've all been in the industry with corn and we all know what hybrid vigor is, but I think it's something we take for granted because it's just assumed with corn. But hybrid vigor is a real thing, and with our rye, you can see it tillers a lot. The roots are very thick. It's a very, very aggressive growth in the spring. So that is the biggest difference between us and the open pollinated rye is we have that hybrid vigor that comes along with that. Just another photo showing what that looks like, and another photo there of the roots there. So it really does tiller, and that is why it's very important to get that planting population correct. If you were to say you did double it, you planted it how you would do your open pollinated rye, a lot of that tillering is not going to happen, and you're going to have smaller, thinner stems, and it's going to be a potential for lodging. So one thing with our hybrid rye, none of our hybrid rye is GMO, but what we do have is something called Pollen Plus technology. Ergot is a problem with rye. It always has been, and when it becomes a problem is uneven stands. When the pollination is happening, and if an ergot spore lands on an anther before the pollen does, it's going to create that dark looking twig thing there that is ergot. And ergot has some hallucinogenic effects. It's very bad if it's consumed by animals and humans. So one thing that we tried to do is we wanted to improve on that. And the breeders have developed this Pollen Plus technology. It's a naturally occurring gene that just sheds a ton of pollen. So these hybrid rye fields are going to pollinate in probably less than 24-hour window, and they're going to shed a lot of pollen to try to beat those ergot spores to there, and potentially try to minimize that risk of ergot. The problem where you're going to see ergot is if you're driving through with your sprayer, anywhere you're going to stunt growth or delay growth outside of that normal pollination window, you're going to open yourself up for an ergot infestation. This is a picture of the difference between two different hybrids. So the hybrid on the left, that is a competitors in Europe. There's currently no other hybrid rye being sold in the United States except KWS, but there are some in Europe. And this is one of the competitors. And you can see there with our technology on the right, just the amount of pollen that plant sheds compared to the competitors on the left. And there's just a really good picture of that. I've heard about between 10 and 11 a.m. If you have allergies nearby a wheat field, you're going to want to run away because it looks like a cloud of fog there over that field. But that's all the pollen. That's the little marketing logo there of what the Pollen Plus is. And remember, it's not a GMO; it's a naturally occurring gene. If you One thing that's very important with our hybrid rye is we cannot replant it. You cannot bin run rye. It's just like corn. As far as a hybrid, you have to treat it like that. So never replant. If you replant it, you're going to lose a lot of the hybrid vigor. You're going to lose the Pollen Plus technology, and it's not going to be good, and it's illegal. So it's best not to replant. Um, and if I think the easiest thing is just treat it like your corn crop, and you'll be fine with that.
Hey, Justin, we have a question in the chat real quick about manure injection in early spring. If you want, I can go ahead and answer that real quick.
Yes.
So manure application in early spring is possible. There's a couple limitations. The first of all, we typically don't recommend an injection because we're talking about something that could potentially disturb already established root mass, growth, things like that. So we don't typically recommend injection. The other issue with manure application in early spring is, there's often a substantial amount of time required for that nitrogen and those nutrients that are in manure to actually become available to the plant. And so when we're injecting in really early spring or springtime, the issue is the rye needs those nutrients so quickly and so rapidly there in the spring that oftentimes with manure applications at that time of season, sometimes those nutrients aren't available enough to the crop. We're going to be able to get some out of it, but there's some limitations. So I hope that answers your question.
Okay. Thank you, Becca. Next slide.
Justin, can you pause for 1 second?
Of course.
Brad asked it. So you're saying no manure? I don't think that's the answer. A lot of the management styles around here, Becca, is a lot of manure goes on in February, very early March. Mm-hmm. I guess the biggest question is, can the rye handle it, the traffic on it, before it really starts growing?
That early, yes, rye can handle traffic on it. As long as you are on that field before elongation starts. So when we show that graph of, the plant's growing this way, this way, this way, and then it starts elongating. Once it starts elongating, that's when you really want to stay off the plant because that's when it can't handle additional traffic and things like that. And that's when you're going to delay it and you're going to hit yield. I'm not saying no to manure. Manure absolutely works and hybrid rye can certainly handle it. I'm saying we have to keep in mind how we're applying that manure and availability of that manure to know if we're meeting the crop's needs. Does that make sense? We have lots of customers that are very successful with only using manure application for their fertility for their hybrid rye.
Yep, that answers the question, I think.
All right. And this is rye in general, but rye creates a little allelopathy, which it basically releases toxins into the soil that reduces, it minimizes weeds. If sometimes it'll keep them from germinating. If they start to germinate, it can kill them. But you can see there in the pictures with the triticale, the winter wheat, and the spring oats and the hybrid rye, it has really good natural weed suppression. And because of that, you're going to save money on chemicals. There's not a lot of disease issues with rye, so you can save money on fungicides as well. It uses 1/3 less water than wheat, so there's a lot of benefits there. But that's showing there the benefit of weed control. These next couple slides are just going to really kind of going back because I'm getting ready. This is the ending of the slides, but going back to my beginning comments about planning and how the best way, how it's so important to get off to the right start in planning. And if you go out there and there's crop residue all over and you're just planting on top of it, you're going to have an uneven stand, and that's just going to haunt you for the rest of the growing season with different concerns. So, take your time. If we don't like to just get the old rusty drill out. I think you guys all plant enough rye. You probably have pretty good equipment, but just plan it the best you can. Make sure you have a really good planting bed, and that'll benefit you throughout the season. And that's just a more up close picture of that. So we have hybrid rye for forage and grazing. ProGas, that is the one Carl is going to be selling the most of. Really good for early heading, cutting, high tons, quality, and very digestible. And then the one on the bottom, that is Aviator. Aviator is on a soft launch this year. I don't know, it's on availability. So I don't know if it's going to be in your area or not, but next year we're going to have more of it. And from very early on, our yield trials, Aviator is looking really good. So we're really excited about Aviator. It's got really good winter hardiness, and it's got some early spring growth. You can go through these next ones, Becca, just go through them. These are all our grain varieties. We do have grain varieties available for the feeding and distilling markets. I understand, this is more for forage, so I just wanted to make mention of those, that they are available. We have about 3 to 4. The fourth one is also on a soft launch, but looking forward to those. And we have a breeding team over in Europe that's continually trying to bring on new varieties to the market. So just stay tuned, and I think you'll see more coming available, in the upcoming years.
So before we switch gears, any other agronomic questions? If you don't want to type them in, you can flip your mic off, and we're happy to answer them. Just jump on and ask your question.
Is there any problem with in the spring we need to spray, or even in the fall with for chickweed? I can't even think of the name that we use. It keeps changing, but there's oftentimes we got to spray for chickweed.
Yeah, so, herbicide application is strictly on an as-needed basis. We don't typically recommend one, but we certainly see areas of the country where guys have very specific weed pressure where sometimes we need one. If you're seeing you need it with your conventional rye, or if you guys are using conventional rye and you see you need it, chances are you're going to need it for the hybrid, but we typically, it's on an as-needed basis for herbicide applications. Paul, I see your question in chat. Can you discuss plant date again? Yep, absolutely. I guess I don't know exactly what you want to know about plant date, so I'll try to kind of get close. Hybrid rye has a pretty broad planting date window, quite frankly. We see some guys plant it quite early in the fall. A caution on planting super early in the fall is if you get lots and lots of forage growth going into the fall and into the winter season. Sometimes we can set yourself up for snow molds or issues like that, where you just simply have too much forage going into the season. And if you plant super late into the season, we don't see good fall tillering. So if you're trying to put this crop in, we see guys try to do November, Thanksgiving timeframes like that. They have a little warm spell and they try to sneak it in. It may germinate and you may get a crop the next spring, but if we don't see good tillering and we don't see good growth from that plant, you're going to substantially impact your yield. So planting date is pretty typical, I would say, aligns with your other small grain cereals in the region. If you're sticking tight within those dates, you're going to be very comfortable with your hybrid rye planting. Does that answer your question? All right. Also, what about an insecticide treatment, thinking aphids and barley yellow dwarf issues? Almost all of our seed comes untreated. We, in a couple locations, will sometimes put an insecticide on, but very rarely. As a whole, not an issue. And I see you talking about barley yellow dwarf. Leaf health on our hybrids tends to be very, very good. There tends to be very few needs for those types of maintenance issues on our hybrid rye. It's one thing that's really unique about the hybrid rye is basically the plant health and the leaf health of those crops. And so that's not something we see an issue with, actually.
And seed treatment is something we can offer if it is needed. We can do that on site as basis, but everything will be coming in without treatment on it. But treatment is something we can add if it's something we need to experiment with. But yeah, we are starting to deal with pretty significant barley yellow dwarf and triticale and rye in this area, especially towards the southern end. And I think that's a concern that's growing quite rapidly.
Any other questions? All right, feel free to keep typing questions in the chat if you have other kind of agronomic related questions, and we'll jump in and try to answer those again at the very end. And we'll have lots of times for questions when we get to the end as well. So if other things pop into your head, please feel free to ask those when we get through the presentation. Going to switch gears a little bit. I know Justin talked about kind of agronomics and things that go into getting plant established, fertility, all those types of things. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about what does this crop look like from a yield perspective? How is it competing in your region with other crops that you guys are maybe a little bit more familiar with from a forage standpoint? We rely very heavily on third-party testing services. So we submit most of our seed to universities and their forage testing services. So all this data that you're going to see is third-party service. We provided seed, but they did all of the research and all of the work, and this is their data ultimately. And so, you know, that's something we rely very heavily on, and we use for getting our data out there for you guys to see. So I'm going to start with some data from 2021, so that was harvested last year. 2022 data is just now coming in. I have a couple sneak peeks for you guys to see. Even though these crops were harvested several months ago, sometimes our universities are not the quickest in terms of turnaround on data. So I have some of it in and some of it in this presentation, but you'll be able to see that as well. So the first trial I'm going to highlight comes from Cornell's forage trial in New York. This was a comparison of our hybrid rye versus some of the maybe open pollinated style of rye that maybe you're familiar with. So Hazlitt and Danko were both in this trial. We had 3 varieties in this trial. You'll see KWS Pro Blend. We don't currently offer this anymore, but Pro Blend is literally what it sounds. It is a blend of Pro Gas and Pro Power. Basically, they have separate cutting times, and we were trying to spread the window of availability for farmers to have the opportunity to cut. And ultimately, we found that most people just decided they would rather go with one or the other and commit to having a variety that excelled in one area. KWS Pro Gas is typically what we would recommend for our early cut. So those guys that are trying to double crop when you want the best, highest quality forage available, that's KWS Pro Gas. And so we're talking flag leaf, that early boot stage when we want to get the best yield possible, the highest quality possible. KWS Pro Gas really excels there. And you can see it won the New York trial last year, cut at that time point. And then actually, if we don't consider Pro Blend, it won that trial as well, and Pro Blend edged it out just a little bit in that trial. So Pro Gas performs very well across the board, but it's definitely one of our top forage varieties. These yields are adjusted to 35% dry matter, so these would almost be as a as-fed yield basis, just for your reference. And get my slides to advance. There we go. Next up would be Pennsylvania. So this is the Penn State trial that was harvested May of last year. Again, we had Pro Gas, Pro Blend, and Pro Power in that trial, and compared to other kind of conventional rye. So Hazlitt, Wheeler, and Aroostook were in this one. Pro Gas again performs very well, out yielding some of our conventional older style rye by almost over 2 tons to the acre. So very competitive in Pennsylvania yield trial as well. We also had these varieties down in Virginia. And so these were in northern part of Virginia with their extension co-op there. Both Pro Power and Pro Gas were in that trial. In this trial, we had them up against triticales, which are another kind of very common forage source that we compete with when entering the feed market. And then also a forage winter wheat was in this trial as well. Again, Pro Gas and Pro Power, very competitive in this yield trial as well. And these were actually harvested in late April, so very early in the season. Just so you guys can see a little bit of quality data too, because this is also something we talk about our hybrid rye, is not only have they been bred to be high yielding, but they've been bred for improved quality, increased digestibility, those types of things. And so I want to share just a little bit of data in terms of what that looks like. So this would be the 2020 Penn State forage trial, so from a couple years ago. And there's a couple things that we find very fascinating right from the start. The first is harvest date. So our hybrid rye are typically ready for harvest a week or so earlier than the commercial triticale forage lines that would be in the market. So if you're trying to double crop and you're looking at a triticale versus a hybrid rye, it's a very competitive advantage we see for the hybrids for guys working that double cropping system. One of the other things that is very impressive about our hybrids, and one of the things we talk about, is our digestibility of that fiber. So obviously good high fiber is good, but highly digestible fiber is the best. And so if you look at our hybrid rye versus how they compare to some of the commercial triticales on the market, not only are they ready earlier, not only are they high yielding, but they're also very high quality. So we see higher crude proteins, higher NDF digestibilities, and higher total track NDF digestibilities. So sneak peek, here is the brand new data from Penn State that we just got a few days ago for our hybrid rye. We did get beat for the first time finally by a couple of the new triticales in the market in terms of yield, but only just barely. And if you're a math nerd and you put statistics on this, they will tell you that there is no difference between the top 5 varieties in this trial. They all yielded the same according to math. So still very competitive at the very top end of the trial. Again, ready for harvest a week to almost 10 days earlier than the triticales that are out there. Very high crude protein and very high NDF digestibilities. There are a couple other experimental rye people are starting to try and put in the market now that they're seeing success with some of the new hybrids. You'll find these down here. Also ready earlier, but just didn't have the yield punch of the hybrids. And brand new from Virginia Tech. We only had ProGas in this trial, but it also performed very, very well. It was ready 5 days earlier than the triticales. It drastically won the yield trial by over 2 tons to the acre, maintained good crude protein, high NDF quality, and like I said, ready earlier as well. So yield data is very impressive from what we've seen out of these, our hybrid varieties in your region. New York, Pennsylvania, down into Virginia, all those areas, they seem to perform very, very well. Very competitive to the other small grain forages that are being used in the region. And so we're very excited about them from that standpoint. Like the trial results show, our breeding focus has really been for high yield and high digestibility. And I always like to tell this story because I find it quite amusing when we think about a breeding program focusing on forage crops. So lots of times forage crops kind of get the back burner, right, from breeding companies. They're worried about grain yields. They're worried about those high income grain crops that they can pump a lot of breeding money into. And so people find it fascinating that we have hybrid rye varieties, not only for high yielding grain, but also for high yielding forage. And how this actually came about is, you know, our breeding company and our headquarters are based in Europe. So they started breeding these varieties over in Germany. And in Germany, they're highly government subsidized for creating crops for what they call their concrete cow or their biogas production system. And so basically they need forage crops that are incredibly high yielding and incredibly high digesting to go into their concrete cow for biogas production, energy production. And there's lots of money that the government subsidizes to make this happen. And because of that, a breeding focus was for high yielding, highly digestible forage rye. A bunch of nutritionists sat down and started scratching our heads and said, hang on, why are we not feeding this to cattle if it's high yielding and highly digestible? And so ultimately that's where these varieties came from. And it's why the older varieties have names like ProGas and ProPower, because that's what they were bred for, is actually biogas production in Europe. So a happy coincidence that's worked out great for us livestock producers. So high yielding, highly digestible. Also, we've really focused on those early harvest dates. and how do we set you guys up for success in terms of having ability to double crop and having these crops ready as early as possible. It's one of the reasons we're super excited about Aviator, as it really seems to be pushing the limits in terms of being even earlier while still being incredibly high yielding. Real quick, I'm going to show you an on-farm trial that we did a couple years ago with a dairy farmer in Wisconsin. So this is Meffert's Homestead Dairy. He had been using VNS, variety not stated, brown bag, old style rye for many, many years, chopping it for silage and double cropping it with his corn silage. And he'd kind of heard about the hybrid. And so we put together an offer for him and said, hey, let's give it a try. Let's take a couple of your fields of rye that you're used to planting. Let's split them 50-50 down the middle. And let's see how the hybrid can do compared to what you're already doing. And so that's exactly what we did. The first thing that I like to highlight and show guys that I think is very fascinating is his old style VNS brown bag rye. He was putting in the ground at 100 pounds to the acre. So, you know, a lot of guys would say 2 units to the acre, but basically 100 pounds. The KWS ProGas that year at 0.8 units was 44.4 pounds to the acre. So less than half the amount of seed. Which is sometimes hard to wrap your brain around, and it's a little bit challenging to understand. But Justin talked about hybrid vigor, and that's absolutely what we want to take advantage of, is crops that have that hybrid vigor. This was cut late May for his yields. This is where I always like to stump people, because I have this picture. I took this standing next to this field. This is kind of the center line that splits the VNS versus the hybrid. And I typically ask people to take a guess which one is which. And 90% of the time, the people tell me that the one on the left is the hybrid. And then I remind them that hybrids have been bred to be shorter. They've been bred to be more uniform in height so that we don't have lodging issues, so that we have easier harvest. And as soon as I start telling that to people, they say, well, maybe the hybrid is on the right. And that's absolutely the case. And so this is one of the things I'm going to caution you guys when you first see a hybrid out in the field versus a VNS rye. It's going to look shorter, and that's absolutely what it should be. But as you can see, shorter does not necessarily mean less yield. So don't panic if the first time you see it, it's several inches shorter than your old style rye or rye that you are used to seeing. It's been bred for lots. A very dense, a very thick crop, your yield is that way, not up, which also helps when we see lodging issues, severe windstorms, things like that. The hybrid rye has a much better chance of staying standing than our old style rye. And actually, lots of times if we go walk yield trials late in the season with other rye, we'll find the hybrids holding up their neighbor plot that is falling over. Just because of that improved standability. So across his 2 separate locations, the orange bar represents his KWS hybrid. I need to fix that. I don't know why it says trit. This should be rye, but that's his old style rye, his VNS rye. And averaged across the 2 locations, the hybrid out yielded his VNS by 26%. So a definite yield boost there. Now, this is a farmer that was applying, we'll say, bare minimum in terms of fertility. I definitely don't think he was cranking these to full potential in terms of yield by any means. And the other thing that you will see is very reflective of fertility, regardless of what type of rye, is your crude protein. This is one of the reasons fertility is really important, not just for yield, but also for talking silage quality. Ryes are very reflective of what they're being provided in fertility. And so if we're not meeting their nitrogen needs, the crop you're going to be harvesting could be very low in crude protein. So something to keep in mind. One of the other calculations we did for this experiment was actually we used the University of Wisconsin's milk equations, which these were originally designed for corn silage. But it allows us to take forage quality and forage yields and extrapolate how many pounds of milk could be created from a ton of that silage and how many pounds of milk you could get per acre of that crop. And so when you're combining yield with quality, which is basically what these numbers do, you can see again that the hybrid rye is highly competitive with some of the old style rye that are in the market. So quick summary of what I've talked about. It's high yielding, highly digestible, good quality, and ultimately, we're continuing to push for yield, but also earlier harvest dates to make it a very competitive crop for a double cropping situation. With that, I am happy to answer any more questions you guys may have. If you don't want to ask questions on the call, which is totally okay, you're more than happy or welcome to kind of send them to Carl or reach out to Carl, and he can get you our contact information if you want to talk with us directly, or if it's a question he can answer too. I'm sure that works as well.
All right, thank you guys very much. A couple side notes on this. Packaging with this stuff, it's coming in 25 unit mini bulks. We can break that down and put it in boxes or other mini bulks to change amounts as needed. Planting rate, like they said, is 0.8 pounds per acre. And I believe a unit this year is 80 pounds currently. So you're looking at a 64 pound an acre seeding rate, so it should be able to go pretty long. Cost of this stuff is actually almost identical per acre as cereal rye if you're going 3 bushel, like I think most of you guys are. So cost per acre is virtually the same. We do need to take a little more care when setting up a drill and doing some calibrations just to make sure we get stuff right. But I don't see any issue. We talked about seeding depth and stuff like that. All of this is going into corn silage ground that is clean can be. We've all got excellent no-till equipment at this point. It shouldn't be any issue for any of us. Does anyone have any other questions pertaining to this? Becca really does know her stuff on the nutrition side. I believe she does have a PhD in rumen something. So
yeah, I have a PhD in ruminant nutrition.
So if anyone's got any nutrition questions, now is the great time to ask her that.
And this is my contact info on the screen. If you want to reach out to me directly, that's my cell phone. Happy to chat anytime.
All right, if we have no other questions, thank you guys very much.
Thanks for having us, Carl.
And we will have a recording of this to send out then.
Yes, yep. I can actually stop recording now.